Welcome to the new frontier, human development and the Anthropocene, the age of man. The 2020 Human Development Report is co-hosted by the UNDP and Sweden. Our official start is courtesy of Her Royal Highness Crown Princess Victoria of Sweden.
Excellencies, ministers, ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to inaugurate the launch of UNDP's 2020 Human Development Report. But first, I wish to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the Human Development Report. In the 30 years since this report was first published, it has continued to broaden our understanding of human progress. It has taught us that development is about so much more than economic growth. It is about opportunity, agency, and realizing the potential of every human being. And over those 3 decades, incredible progress has been made across the world on education, health, life expectancy, and more. However, we are now putting this progress at risk with our own actions. Climate change, pollution, loss of biodiversity. From the deepest ocean to the highest mountain, there isn't a single corner of the planet that is unaffected by us humans. The good news is that it is not yet too late to address these challenges. And, as this report shows, human development is a key part of the solution. As an alumni advocate for the Sustainable Development Goals, I want to underline that the Sustainable Development Goals are still within our reach. But now is the time for action, not later. Ladies and gentlemen, the corona crisis has had great adverse effects on economic, social, and environmental development. On critical targets of the Sustainable Development Goals, progress has stalled. However, perhaps we can also learn something from this turbulent year. In a very short time, people all over the world have changed the way they work, communicate, and do business. Massive resources have been allocated to fighting the pandemic. And thanks to scientific collaboration on a scale never seen before, we now have better tests, better treatments, and vaccines that will hopefully prove to be effective. It seems that the old saying is true. Where there is a will, there is a way. I hope so. And I hope we can let that same sense of urgency and collective responsibility guide us when we choose a wiser and more resilient path for humanity. Thank you.
And thank you, Your Royal Highness. Thank you for joining the very first global launch of the Human Development Report that is virtual. Let me tell you what you can expect coming up in the next 2 hours. You will hear from heads of state. You will hear highlights from the Human Development Report, UNDP Goodwill Ambassadors, reflections, the co-hosting conversation. That is just the first hour. In the second hour, a leader's dialogue, which you get to be in as well. You are in that conversation. You see on your dashboard, there is a little section for Q&A. Please use it. There's a little section for chat. Please use that. And in that chat will be some of the authors of this year's Human Development Report. So you can ask them specific questions and they will do their very best to answer them for them. A little bit along the way, along your dashboard, you will also find the 2 languages that are being offered to you in this conversation. So we're going to have it in English, but you also see interpretation in French and in Spanish. So we have a lot to do. And we start with our co-host, and that is Prime Minister Stefan Löfven. Really good to see you, Prime Minister. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. It is truly a great honor for me to be with you today, even if it is via a screen. I would like to thank Mr. Steiner and the United Nations Development Program for this honor and for organizing this event. I'm very happy that Sweden has been selected as the host country for the global launch of this year's Human Development Report. Today we can look back on 30 years of Human Development Reports. And at the time of their inception, these reports were groundbreaking, and they have indeed had a fundamental impact on how we view and relate to development policies. GDP is no longer the sole measure of success, and I would like to take this opportunity to quote Secretary General Guterres, who said, "Inequality works against human development, and we all suffer from its consequences." End of quote. I have fought to reduce inequality practically my entire professional life. Inequality is toxic to fair and sustainable growth, and it is toxic to development in any country. And as the pandemic increases inequality, the need for action is more urgent than ever. I am pleased that the report and the index launched today not only includes measures of climate and planetary boundaries, and that is important in itself, but beyond that also provide inspiration and concrete recommendations for how we can turn things around. Because climate change is an existential threat to all of us. And if we are to save our planet and our common future, we must step up the pace. We need to act now, and we need to act together. The Paris Agreement celebrated its 5th anniversary last week, and the agreement is a multilateral triumph. And multilateral cooperation now is essential to save the planet. Sweden will do its part, I promise you that. Internationally, by developing innovative technology and providing finance for climate action, and nationally, by intensifying efforts to become the world's first fossil-free welfare nation. Our goal is climate neutrality by 2045, and after that, negative emissions. The report that we are launching today has this strong message. A just transition can only be achieved by addressing environmental, social, and economic issues together. Now, I hope that this report will serve as a guiding light for countries and stakeholders in tackling inequality, in tackling climate change. Those are our shared challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I'm wondering, as co-host of this year's Human Development Report, it's such a milestone as the 30th anniversary, and also 2020 is an extraordinary year. What does that mean for Sweden to be co-hosting this year?
It means a lot. As I believe you already know, Sweden is really a big supporter of the United Nations, a big supporter of multilateral cooperation. And these reports, the Human Development Reports, are truly, truly important also for steering policies towards a development that improves living conditions for people all over the world. And of course, during this year, as we celebrate the 30th anniversary of these reports, it's even more important, and it gives a special feeling that we are able to do this.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister. I will say thank you for now, but we will be bringing you back a little bit later on in the programme. And so, to your other co-host, the UNDP Administrator, Achim Steiner. The floor is yours. And I am going to do that
Ramaphosa.
one.
Are we not?
Administrator, we saw you, we saw your beautiful setup, we didn't hear you, so I'm going to do it one more time because you're worth a double introduction and we will hear your very opening words. Administrator, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Femi. Your Royal Highness, Prime Minister Levin, Prime Minister Motley, President Ramaphosa, distinguished colleagues and friends across the world who are following this launch. What a long, dark year this has been. A tiny virus has humbled the human family, threatening to reverse decades of development. Scientists predicted a pandemic like COVID-19 for years because of the ever greater pressures we humans put on nature in the name of progress. Consider this, the total mass of the things humans have made, like buildings, roads, and bottle tops, now exceeds the total mass of all living things on the planet. From tiny bacteria to giant whales to trees and forests, according to new research. As the Human Development Report we launched today sets out, this is the Anthropocene, or the age of humans. And in it, humanity is waging a war against itself. COVID-19, climate change, inequality, they're all connected, they're all hitting together, and societies are facing traumas. But it doesn't have to be this way. This is a unique moment. It calls for a unique conversation, and that is what UNDP hopes to contribute to today. For 30 years, as the Prime Minister said, UNDP has released the Human Development Report and Index, ranking all countries by health, education, and living standards, a proxy for the freedom and opportunities people living in those countries experience. This year, constrained by mostly pre-pandemic data, we decided to do something new. We added countries' consumption and carbon footprints to a new experimental Human Development Index, Planetary Adjusted Human Development Index, we call it. The results is a lesser, rosy, but clear analysis of human progress. Plotting out the data on a graph reveals a profound insight. There are countries that leave a minimal imprint on the planet. There are countries with prosperous populations, but not one nation in the world sits in both camps. In the graphs used to illustrate this data in the report, we have quite literally an empty box. Filling this empty box is the next frontier for human development. This may sound daunting, but the way forward is not rocket science. It comes down to the incentives, the social norms, and nature-based solutions that will reset how people and planet interact. It comes down to the choices that leaders make as they build forward better from COVID-19. Choices that could stop the pandemic and end poverty, close the digital divide, and tackle the climate emergency, so that we use this unique moment in time to move to the next frontier for people and planet. On poverty, there could be 1 billion poor people in the world by the year 2030, a quarter due to COVID-19. Or we could choose to do things differently, with ambitious policy, social protection, and a deal on debt. For example, a 6-month temporary basic income for nearly 3 billion people during this pandemic would be equivalent to just 1/3 of what poor countries paid this year to service their external debt. On digital, 4 out of 5 children were effectively out of school in poorer countries in the first half of this year because they didn't have the tools they needed for online learning, and millions of children are still out of school. We could let the digital divide deepen, or we could choose to invest in a once-in-a-generation effort to close it. On climate, by the year 2100, the poorest countries in the world could experience up to 100 more days of extreme weather each year as a result of climate change. We could let this happen, or we could cut those 100 days in half by implementing the targets of the Paris Agreement. Choices have shaped this pandemic, whether governments tested and traced whether masks became as uncontroversial as seatbelts. Choices will shape who gets a vaccine and when. Choices will determine how we build forward better from here, because we can. If humans have the power to create an entirely new geological epoch, the Anthropocene, then this, the first generation of the Anthropocene, can use that power to change. I congratulate you, Prime Minister Löfven of Sweden, for your country's ambitious goal of becoming fossil fuel-free by the year 2045, a bold step in line with the findings of today's report. I'm delighted that we're also joined by Prime Minister Motley of Barbados. With one of the world's first blue economy ministries, Barbados is strongly committed to reaching 100% fossil fuel-free energy by the year 2030. And I would also like to thank President Ramaphosa for sending his words of encouragement from South Africa today in the midst of this devastating pandemic. At UNDP, it is our privilege to work with each of you on the global socioeconomic response to COVID-19. To take forward the conversations this report has opened, UNDP is now preparing also a new three-part offer as a bridge forward from our COVID-19 response. It will include providing expertise and tools that help countries to simulate alternative futures based on different policy choices, building on the data in the report and many other databases. Integrated programmatic and financial support that goes beyond the quick technical fixes to accelerate the transition towards greener and more equitable development paths. And tailored national and local policy dialogues to support the evolution of new social norms and build coalitions for change. Excellencies, dear colleagues and friends, this is the 30th anniversary of the concept of human development. Much has changed since the first Human Development Report challenged the primacy of GDP as a measure of human progress. But hope and possibility have not. Our future is not about choosing between people or trees. It's about choosing to do things differently. That is the next frontier for human development. I truly hope that we today, at this unique moment, can commit to exploring these new frontiers together. Thank you, Prime Minister Löfven, for hosting this global launch, and thank you to everyone who has contributed to drafting, reviewing, and ultimately producing the 2020 Human Development Report. And thank you to all those who have joined us today. Thank you very much, and back to you, Femi.
Thank you, Administrator Steiner. I am just wondering, as the Human Development Report is now 30 years old, what kind of 30-year-old are we dealing with? One that has regrets or one that is looking forward to the future with so much hope? If you could look back, what would be your analysis briefly?
Well, I think we can spend a lot of time looking back, and I think from history we learn lessons. But what is quite clear is that time is running out for us. This notion of living in the Anthropocene, the climate challenges we face, the inequality that is tearing us apart in our societies, is essentially forcing us to look forward. We need to decide to do things differently, and I think this report, in a sense, as you call it, a 30-year-old, is combining the wisdom of life lived and also the ability to look into the future with courage and with a willingness to take responsibility, not least because if we don't act, future generations won't even have the choice anymore. So that, I think, is a good image for a 30-year-old to perhaps associate with this year's Human Development Report.
Administrator Steiner, thank you for now. We will come back to you a little bit later in the program. We move on to the Prime Minister of Barbados, Prime Minister Mia Mottley. It is so good to have you at this virtual global launch of the Human Development Report 2020. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I want to say how honored I am to be here. Colleague heads of government, Your Excellencies, Mr. Stefan Löfven, Prime Minister of Sweden, Mr. Sir Ramaphosa, President of South Africa, Mr. Achim Steiner, UNDP Administrator, participants all. Let me begin by thanking Her Royal Highness Crown Princess Victoria for her gracious message and my fellow speakers for their thoughtful presentations. But you know, we live in the best of times and the worst of times. We live at a time when in the last decade we've seen a global financial crisis, we've seen the rise of inequality, we've seen the climate crisis, and now we have this awful pandemic. But at the same time, we live in the best of times because we still have enough time to change the course of history if we have the will to summon up at this point. I'm honored, as I said, to have been asked to participate in today's launch of this 2020 Human Development Report. I especially welcome the opportunity to recognize the extraordinary body of revolutionary work compiled for the last 30 years under the auspices of the UNDP by inspired teams of independent and innovative thinkers. Indeed, since the first report in 1990, when it pioneered the Human Development Index, this report has sought to shift the focus of development economics from the narrow lens of cold statistics on economic growth to the broader sweep of policies with people at its center. Building on that first bold new idea each year, through its choice of themes and through the arguments it has advanced, the Human Development Report has challenged the status quo and has brought fresh approaches to tackling many of the most intractable issues that face our world today. For small island developing states like my own country, Barbados, and others in the Caribbean, our people are our main resource. Building social capital through investment in education and health is at the heart of our policy making. This is who we are. I cannot tell you how often and how strongly successive governments in Barbados have been pressured in the past by international financial institutions and others to end these so-called unsustainable entitlements. But we have persevered, and we have lived to see the tide begin to change. In major ways, the Human Development Report has been a beacon of light to Barbados and to many other small middle-income countries like ours. Its central philosophy speaks directly to us and helps to capture and explore our own realities. Indeed, the Human Development Index was the first authoritative international measurement of human development to validate our national policy choices at independence and to reinforce them in international discourse. For we were the ones who, upon independence, chose to reverse centuries of exploitation of our people, centuries of tyranny, and to place them at the center, trying to begin to build for them opportunities for shelter, education, housing, health, and all of the other things that we now value 55 years later after my country became independent. The Human Development Report has long cautioned against the slavish adherence to the GDP per capita criterion as a reliable measure of development. Indeed, in this year of our Lord, we have had to make too many speeches referring to the fact that GDP per capita is as relevant an instrument when used historically as taking my blood pressure 2 years ago to determine if I'm going to get a stroke today. Similarly, proxies like maternal mortality on their own do not allow for a capture of the vulnerability that small island states face today, and hence the need for a form of a universal vulnerability index. This latest report, my friends, which we launched today, continues in that fine thought-provoking tradition. The choice of theme, human development, and the Anthropocene could hardly have been more apt or more relevant. None of us can deny that 2020 has been a cataclysmic year of extraordinary devastation. Unprecedented floods, drought, wildfires, hurricanes, and record-breaking temperatures, and now indeed this pandemic of biblical proportions. All of these have been unleashed around the world in 2020. We cannot find in living memory a more stark illustration of the impact of human activity on the Earth's ecosystems, a more vivid red flag on the dangerous and growing imbalance between people and planet. I ask us to remember that while scientists continue to debate over if and when we can be considered to have entered a new geological era, the Anthropocene, where human activity has the dominant impact on our Earth's ecosystems, we do not need to wait thousands of years for definitional proof to emerge in rock formations or in fossils. We know it. We already know the answer. And we know in the Caribbean that answer more than most because we are the canaries in the mine. We are on the front line facing battles such as the climate crisis that we didn't cause. For us, the tipping point is here and it is now. A pathogen equally that has crossed from wildlife to humans has joined with the climate crisis that I just referred to, and the other inherent vulnerabilities and inequities. And all of these work to upend the positive global development trajectory that these reports, the Human Development Report, have documented for the past 30 years. The gains of decades, therefore, threaten to be eroded, and it is estimated that as many as 100 million people may be pushed back into extreme poverty because of what we are seeing in 2020. If we seem surprised at the ferocity of this convergence of nature's forces, we really should not be. It is not as if scientists have not warned us in myriad ways about the catastrophic consequences of indiscriminate human action on our natural environment, an environment which remains vital for the support of all forms of life on the planet. That is why my nation has set 2030 as the year by which we would be fossil fuel free at best and carbon neutral at worst, because we have no choice if we want to sustain our people and our region. If we want to sustain our oceans, over which we have jurisdiction 400 times the size of our land. My friends, there have been previous ice ages and mass extinction events in Earth's vast history, but none have been attributable directly to the activities and behaviors of man. The dinosaurs did not know that the asteroid was upon them, nor would they have had the capacity to save themselves had they known. In 2020, however, we, the human race, do not have the luxury of ignorance. The level of scientific knowledge freely communicated throughout our interconnected societies shows us without equivocation that human activity is endangering our planet and threatening the quality of life and eventual survival of future generations. We have reached a transformational moment, my friends, where moral and ethical global leadership is most urgently needed and where it can make a real difference. Moral and ethical global leadership will make a difference to those who need vaccines across the countries of the world, recognizing that it should not only be available to the rich and to the powerful. I also mean honest and dangerous leadership at all levels, within governments and corporations and civil society, as well as among individuals, whether as shareholders or stakeholders, to confront the other crises of which I've spoken. If we heed this wake-up call and refuse to slide back into complacency when the current emergency recedes, I am convinced, my friends, that we can find the will and the capacity to implement policies that strike a sustainable balance between humanity and the planet, a balance that aims to redress social and economic inequalities between and within states, incentivizes behavioral change towards positive environmental stewardship, seeks to fight the next slow-motion pandemic of antimicrobial resistance from now rather than waiting till when it becomes the largest killer of human beings in 2050, finances green transitions and inculcates values of caring and community within our societies. There is one thing I am absolutely certain of, which gives me hope and confidence every day. Either my generation is now prepared to lead as responsible adults, or young children like the ones I've been showing off recently in my own country will become the committed brigade of young activists waiting in the wings, and they will step up and do it for us. It is up to us whether we truly make what is potentially the worst of times the best of times by choosing the right thing to do and by choosing to live differently. I thank you.
Prime Minister Motley, I always love it when you quote Charles Dickens in your opening remarks. There is a social media video that UNDP in Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean are sharing. In fact, all the UNDP offices on social media are sharing. It's a fantastic video. It's a vox pop or man on the street video asking people, what is the Anthropocene? And the answers are funny. Some of them are accurate. And one gentleman says, man, that's such a good word for right now. When you heard that the HDR 2020 was going to be called the New Frontier, Human Development and the Anthropocene, what immediately came to mind? What resonated for you in the context of Barbados?
That it is now or never.
Perfect.
Simple.
I will leave
It's now or never.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Prime Minister Motley, thank you. We go now to the President of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, who will be joining us via video.
Your Royal Highness Crown Princess Victoria of Sweden, Your Excellency Prime Minister Stefan Löfven of Sweden, Your Excellency Prime Minister Maya Motley of Barbados, Administrator of the United Nations Development Programme, Mr. Achim Steiner, Excellencies and ladies and gentlemen. South Africa congratulates the United Nations Development Programme on the launch of the 30th edition of the Human Development Report. Since its first edition was released in 1990, the report has raised awareness around the most critical development issues of our time. In the words of the UNDP itself, the report advances the notion of holistic human development that is focused on people, their opportunities, and their choices. As we count the costs of the devastating COVID-19 pandemic, it is more important than ever that we focus our collective energies on building a new world that is more egalitarian, more prosperous, and more sustainable. It is therefore appropriate that this year's report locates the next frontier of human development within the context of humankind's relationship with the planet. We wholly endorse the assertion that instilling a sense of stewardship of nature is key to our collective prosperity. In partnership with the UNDP, the international community and multilateral organizations, we remain firmly on a path towards an inclusive, low-carbon and developmental society. We are entering an era of reconstruction and rebuilding in the wake of the devastation caused by COVID-19. This presents us with an opportunity to give effect to the human, social, and economic and environmental principles of sustainable development. We are greatly encouraged that this year's report proposes new metrics to gauge human development that address our interconnectedness with nature. As we have stood as one to confront the threat of this pandemic, let us continue to work together to expand the frontiers of human endeavor in a manner that respects the boundaries and limitations of our natural world. The 2020 Human Development Report will be a vital tool in our efforts as we move along a more sustainable path. It is essential that we take this path not just for our own sake, but for the sake of future generations. I thank you.
Thank you, President Ramaphosa. And now it is the biggest day of his professional year, the biggest day. Pedro Conceição is the Director of the Human Development Report Office. It is so good to see you, Director. What do we need to know about the Human Development Report 2020?
Thank you, Femi. Prime Minister Löfven, Prime Minister Motley, Achim. I think I can be brief because I cannot match the eloquence with which the key messages of the report have already been shared. Let me just reiterate the idea that as we live through these disorienting times, with the pandemic, climate change, development trends that are seemingly going into reverse, that the report invites us to take a step back and to see all of these challenges less than separate problems and much more as a reflection of an unprecedented moment in our history and the history of our planet, in which, as we have heard, human pressures on the planet are driving dangerous planetary change. Some scientists are arguing that we're entering a new geological epoch of the Anthropocene. And what this suggests is that we are facing an unprecedented set of new risks that are of our own making and that are harming us already and all forms of life. But I will concentrate briefly on 3 points that emerge from the report. One, that has to do with the challenge that we confront. Secondly, the goal. And finally, some thoughts on the way forward. So the challenge is not only that we're confronting this new generation of risks that I mentioned, but they are actually superimposed onto a world with large and often growing inequalities that are being exacerbated by these risks. So if we take COVID-19, just to give an example on the fact that the economic impact has been much worse for women than men. And this because women are overrepresented in part in economic sectors more affected, but also more concerning because some of the social norms about the expectation of the role of women in homework are reasserting themselves. So many women are pulling back from the labor force with drops of as much as 10 percentage points in the labor force participation of women that we document in the report. And this represents a reversal of progress that had taken decades to achieve. But these patterns actually hold more generally. So take a look at these numbers. In the graph on the left side, we see that countries that face more ecological threats, this relates to drought, floods, storms, are also those where gender inequality is higher. And if we look at inequality in human development more broadly, the graph on the right, we see that the story is very much the same. Inequalities are also linked to dangerous planetary change, given that there are huge asymmetries in consumption and in power between those that over-extract and over-pollute and those bearing the consequences. As Achim said, and these numbers show, if you look at the red lines, low human development countries, so poor countries, by the end of the century are likely to face 100 days more of extreme heat, while rich countries are likely to face 18 days less days of extreme heat per year. Now, this is not inevitable. The blue lines show that if we take measures to mitigate climate change, the number of very hot days in poor countries can actually be cut by half. Now, these choices, so this is not inevitable, but has to do, as we've heard, with the choices that we make. And what the report suggests is that they have to be framed in a way that does not leave our embeddedness and dependence on nature and on our planet on the background, but actually brings it to the core, to the fore. So the goal, moving now to my second point, has to do with advancing human development, which remains vital, but we have to be mindful also of the pressures that we're putting on our planet. Because otherwise the very notion of human development for many today and everyone in the future will be foreclosed. So if we compare the level of human development index, which you see on the horizontal axis in this slide, with an index that we propose of planetary pressures on the vertical axis, you see this green triangle at the bottom that Ari mentioned as the empty space. So this corresponds to the place where we want to go, the new goal of human development, which is to continue to advance human development, but do it in a way in which we reduce planetary pressures. The blue dots represents the position of countries today, and you see that while some are closer to this currently empty space, and some are moving in this direction, none is close enough, and none is moving fast enough. So the goal is to advance human development by reducing, or while reducing also planetary pressures. Now, advancing human development is not only about people's well-being, but it's also about giving them conditions to make different choices. And this brings me to the last point on the way forward. Now, The report speaks about three mechanisms to enable people to do and encourage them actually to make different choices. First, social norms. Much like social norms around things like using masks or smoking in shared spaces, we must now seek to establish norms that give greater weight to easing planetary pressures. Already there is some evidence that during the pandemic, internet searches related to recycling and reusing, for instance, went up. Second, incentives and regulation that can be used to promote or deter action, shifting prices, for instance, that shape what people consume, what firms produce, where investors allocate their savings, the technologies we invest in, the science priorities we put forward. This can be done not only by incorporating damages from planetary pressures in current prices, but also phasing out fossil fuel subsidies and the current context of low demand for energy and low oil prices provide actually favorable context to do so. And then third and finally, looking at nature not as a constraint, as something that impedes development in some sense, but actually as a potential collaborator in advancing human development while protecting and restoring ecosystems. An example is the blue economy, the potential of the oceans to provide for economic opportunity, well-being, if we invest in protecting them, are an important example. Now, standing in the way of all of these mechanisms that I just mentioned are important imbalances in power and voice, and I'll close with an example. We show in the report that contribution of some indigenous peoples on a per person basis to manage forests that work as a carbon sink is roughly equivalent to the carbon dioxide emissions per person of the top 1% of the global income distribution. And in many cases, these indigenous populations are the very people that are often facing persecution and discrimination around the world. So these inequalities are putting seemingly people and planet on a collision course, but it doesn't have to be that way. So we can make different choices, as we've heard repeatedly up to now. And our aspiration is that this 2020 Human Development Report will help signposts how to continue to advance human development while easing planetary pressures, moving us towards meeting the Sustainable Development Goals and the aspirations of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Now, let me conclude by thanking my team and all the others that made this year's report possible, including the members of our advisory board, statistical panel, but perhaps more importantly, all those that over the last 30 years have produced human development reports. And of course, none of this would have been possible and would have happened without the vision and drive of Mahbub ul Haq, who introduced the concept of human development 30 years ago. So the best tribute that we can pay him is to continue to expand human development towards the next frontier. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Yemi Alade and I am speaking to you from Lagos, Nigeria in Africa. The COVID-19 pandemic has widened inequalities across the world and the poorest are hit the hardest. This does not exempt my homeland, Nigeria. This pandemic could be a preview of the new normal unless we relax our grip on nature and fast. This year, UNDP's Human Development Report shows us how climate change and biodiversity loss are leading to planetary imbalances and growing inequality, causing the most vulnerable communities to suffer the most. And the unfair distribution of power means that those with the least say in how things are done are especially women. But this isn't inevitable. A better, more resilient planet and people is possible. Let's choose to invest more in green energy, in projects like reforestation that help local communities and restore ecosystems. Let's use human development to empower people as stewards of the planet. Let's fight inequality and ensure everyone has an equal voice. Now is our chance to build a brighter future.
Humanity is at a crossroads. People are putting too much pressure on our planet, which puts us all at risk. A year ago, I joined the United Nations Development Programme on a fact-finding mission to the Amazon rainforest in Peru. I saw the devastating environmental consequences of deforestation, and I also met with communities living in extreme poverty, people with no choice but to clear sections of the forest to plant food needed to feed their families. I witnessed how inequality and poverty are intertwined with the climate crisis. Only by tackling these challenges together can we fix our planet and our societies. Reforestation is just one of the nature-based solutions that can help communities flourish and lower carbon emissions. A future where both people and planet can thrive is possible. Let's make it a reality.
While humanity has achieved incredible things, it's clear that we have taken our planet for granted. Across the world, young people have spoken up. We see the damage done to our planet by governments, by businesses, by those who are in charge. And we know that these actions put our collective future at risk. We will not accept that this is the only way of doing things. It's time for humans to fix the mess we have created. As the 2020 Human Development Report makes clear, we need to transform our relationship with the planet, to make energy and material consumption sustainable, to ensure every young person is educated and empowered to fully appreciate the wonders that a healthy world can provide, so that all young people, especially in their diversity, have a say over their lives and their planet. We are the first generation that truly comprehends this challenge, and it is up to all of us to demand a better future.
The Human Development Report has never had a virtual global launch before, so how are we doing? Well, on the specialized platform, on this little web picture right here, there are over 1,700 of you. Even more on Facebook and more on Twitter, posting using hashtag HDR2020. And if you're on the dashboard, the specialized dashboard for the Human Development Report 2020, in the comments and the question section, you will find UNDP team members who were involved in the writing of this year's report, who will answer your questions, well, as many as they possibly can. The co-hosts for this year's report, UNDP and also Sweden. So Prime Minister Löfven, good to have you back. And also Administrator Steiner, welcome back as well. I really love the way that you started off our launch. It was formal, it was appropriate. I'm going to ask you something just off the cuff because I'm wondering what's going on in your brain right now. So no filter, okay? No filter. The first thing you think of, Prime Minister is quaking, but no need. I say to you, Prime Minister Löfven, 2020, what's your immediate reaction back to me?
It was quite hit to the heart. There was some noise. I couldn't really hear a question. Sorry.
Not a problem. If I say the year 2020, your immediate reaction back. 2020. Immediate candid reaction. Pandemic.
Pandemic.
Right.
Pandemic. It's a really, it's a hard year for the whole world's population. So we have to really combat this pandemic, and in doing so, make sure also that we advocate for equality in doing so.
Okay, very good. Administrator Steiner, I say green growth to you. Your immediate, unfiltered reaction back is what?
The future, right before us, already around us, and I think inevitable coming out of this pandemic, the way that we need to think about our economies, our societies in the future.
And one more, Human Development Report, Prime Minister.
One more. Okay. Yeah.
The Human Development Report, instant reaction back, no filter. First thoughts that come to mind.
First thing, it is about hope, and that we actually combine the necessity of developing our societies with the climate perspective. So I think we're reaching a momentum now where more and more people see both the necessity of combating climate change, but also the positive perspective of that. It's not a burden. It's not something that we have to do, something that we want to do, because we can now clearly see here is the new technology, here is the future welfare. So I think I really think it's a positive thing that the climate issue is so clearly underlined in this report.
Administrator Steiner, it was almost just moments into the COVID crisis where I started to hear the phrase coming from the development world of build back better. You finesse that a little bit more, build back greener, more equitably, sustainably. What does that actually mean now that we are in December?
I think what this notion of not going back to where we were is, first of all, in December, a realization that that world that we lived in before COVID hit us already was full of challenges. And whether we look to climate change, to inequality, I just remember the last 24, 36 months, the evening news, the newspapers, we had demonstrations, we had people across the world, young people losing confidence and patience, people who are poor losing confidence in governments. When politics, steps out into the streets, this is always a sign that, whether you call it a social contract, you call it governance, there are many ways to describe it. We are losing a consensus and we lose confidence in the future. From there, polarization comes. People buy out, they don't buy in. They get angry. When you're hungry, it is easy to get angry because you see at the same time extraordinary wealth on the other side of a fence or of a street. So I think in December 2020, first of all, we are scared because we've lost control. And the simple fact is 2020 was a year where we lost control over lives and the way we thought we can run the world. And we are scared because we're not quite sure whether we can really build forward better from here. And I think that's why to Prime Minister Löfven's, and by the way, good afternoon, Prime Minister, we have been sitting in separate virtual rooms, but it's fantastic to be here with you. I think it is precisely this moment in which leadership suddenly becomes such a vital currency in our societies and not the financial currency, because it is leadership that we need to not drift back to where we were before. And we have to make bold choices. The decision to have this experimental planetary adjusted human development index was also a risk because it is an experimental one and we could be criticized for not having presented a perfect index. But it was the right thing to do, I think, this year, because people want to discuss precisely the uncertainties and the choices around here. And I think that's where leadership is something that is not just limited to prime ministers and presidents, to CEOs. It's actually within each one of us to find that strength of conviction to lead forward. And that's, to me, December 2020. Scared, but not giving up.
Prime Minister, do you sense that fear in Sweden, particularly about employment, the economy, and the way ahead? Because your commitment to employment, your commitment to sustainability, has that wavered in any way this year?
Well, I would say that in the beginning, when we started to really push for this to combat climate change, yes, there was a bit of resistance, fear. What does it really mean for the economy, for my job? But as I said, I'm sure now we're reaching a momentum where more and more people see that it is possible, due to the fact that we as a country decided upon this goal of becoming climate neutral by 2045, and being very persistent in that goal, making sure that we have a framework, a climate framework in handling this, putting up goals for different sectors of the economy, making sure that we cooperate with different sectors of the economy, creating roadmaps. Now we can see, the steel industry, and listen to this, steel has been produced in the same way, basically, for 1,000 years. Now we are developing a new way of producing steel without using coal. That's a revolution. Now we have our biggest mining company changing its whole production structure to become climate neutral. And in doing so, they're not only producing their own products climate neutral, but also giving their customers a chance to produce climate neutral products. So this is now changing totally, and we're making sure that cars need to be clean in the future, step by step by step. So now we can see, yeah, it doesn't mean that we're losing our job. It means new jobs, yes. So we have to make sure that we can cope with this transition. And another key word is to make sure that everybody is on board on this future project, meaning that we have to also be sure that people can get training for new jobs. But more and more people see now this is possible. We can both combat climate change and create new jobs, and thereby also making sure that we can tell our kids you will have clean air in the future, you can live a good life, but also making sure that you have jobs in the future and developing your own life. So I think this is crucial.
I can see why you're both in the same conversation together, Prime Minister and Administrator, because Administrator, I've heard you so many times say it doesn't have to be people or the planet, that both are possible. And that seems to be what's underlying this year's Human Development Report. Can you expand on that a little bit more?
Well, Femi, you know, often when I speak to young people in schools, it's so obvious, it's so self-evident that young people actually intuitively get it far quicker than when we grow up to be adults and rationalize all sorts of trade-offs. And how on earth will we live on the planet with soon 9-10 billion people and continue to pollute the atmosphere? I mean, we are changing the climate. We are destroying the biosphere. There is an obvious logic to saying it cannot be people or planet, and yet we have been entrapped. And, 30 years ago, when Mahbub ul-Haq and Amartya Sen had this bold vision of challenging this notion that human progress is essentially a matter of measuring it by economic metrics of, gross domestic product, they were criticized, they were challenged. Many rejected the initial Human Development Index as distorting and naive. And yet, here we are, 30 years later. Look at how our societies are in part falling apart over inequality, and therefore the choices that we need to make are actually not God-given or in the realm of the laws of physics. We can choose to have cleaner energy. The patents for renewable energy technology have been in drawers since the beginning of the 20th century. Why did it take us 100 years to act on them? Because we didn't believe we had to make a choice, and we just thought we would go on. So, to me, what the Prime Minister also said just now, we now live in an age, this age of the Anthropocene, that is, in one sense, yes, a harsh reminder that we have crossed a certain threshold and that we are in very dangerous territory. But we're also the richest, most educated generation with the greatest new technological frontiers also available to us. We can define whole new choices that we make. And that, I think, is where the moment takes us right now. People or planet is the conversation of the 19th and 20th century. I think the 21st century is about getting to that box in the graph that the Human Development Report has so clearly identified, which is the future. And if we don't get there, the future gets bleaker and bleaker. And I think climate change in some ways relates so well to the pandemic also, because what COVID-19 showed us just in a matter of 3 months is what climate change will do to us for 300 or even 1,000 years. We cannot simply put the foot on the brake, get out of a problem and move into another planet. Climate change locks us in for literally hundreds of generations. And that time window is a constant reminder of how in COVID-19, we knew that this could happen. We even prepared for it to some extent, and yet we could not control it. And look how much suffering this has caused in just 11 months. That's why I think this year's Human Development Report is such a bold way of saying, stop giving us false choices and trade-offs. Let us shape the kind of society and economy we want. And out of that does not come an environmentalist nirvana or a social activist nirvana. It is the consensus we build about how much inequality do we really want to tolerate in our societies, how much destruction of the environment are we prepared to justify in order to do X for 5 cents less than before. These are the false choices we have been locked into for so long. And I think it is high time that we listen to our young people. They have understood this far more clearly. They are far more prepared to act on it. And I think those of us who have a possibility to, whether it is a prime minister in my capacity, your capacity, Femi, as a broadcaster, as somebody who speaks to millions of people, let's stop living in denial. Let's act with responsibility. And I think that is a new way of thinking about what comes next.
Prime Minister, that is a direct challenge, not just to you and to Sweden, but to all of us. How are you going to take on that challenge heading into the new year and beyond?
As I said, being very persistent on the goal that basically it's very simple. We must give that promise to the children and our grandchildren. I can say every time I meet our family's grandchildren, I think about this. What are their future? It is my task. All of us need to be very persistent in making sure that they can live a good life in the future when it comes to climate. But the good thing is also that talk about all the things that will be better, not only the climate, but also jobs and all these things, the welfare, the equality, combating inequality, that we can do so much more in making sure that people are getting on board on the future project. Because today we're not only letting people starve, which is bad enough, but we're not taking the resources, we're not using all the resources that we have. The humanity has still so much to do. And therefore look at this positive side, that we have a double positive side. The climate is one, but better lives for all humanity. And that takes a national decision making, a local, but also a global, a multilateral. And I'm looking forward to continue cooperating with all colleagues all over the world to make sure now we do this together. And I think perhaps that is the strongest signal we can send, is doing it together. We will make it. There's no doubt about that.
Gentlemen, Prime Minister, Administrator, may I congratulate you on having a free-flowing conversation in two very different parts of the world. You've absolutely nailed the virtual part of our global launch. Thank you very much. Appreciate you.
I mean, may I
Thank
add
you.
one last small remark? Because
Of course, you're the administrator of UNDP. I'm not allowed to say no to you.
Absolutely.
No, I just want to say, because one of the interesting things in this year's Human Development Report is actually that Sweden, contrary to many other high developed, wealthier countries, didn't change its ranking as much. And in that sense, I want to recognize also that the deliberate over a number of years and governments direction that Swedish society chose to drive its own development is already putting it in a class of very few countries that are a step ahead of where many others are. And this is not, I think, only a matter of being richer or wealthier. It comes down to the choices that Swedish people made and that are paying off today. And I think we have a lot to learn. And that's why I was so pleased, Prime Minister, when you invited us today to come and launch this report with you from Sweden, but at the same time speak to all the realities across the globe. And I think Prime Minister Motley reminded us also, when you're a small island developing state, you have far less freedom to choose. You depend so much more on other people's choices. And that's one reason why I believe so much in the United Nations. And I thank Sweden also for its commitment, because it is sometimes for the countries that don't rate on the top of a radar or a league table, that I think the United Nations is a vital part of keeping our eyes on what matters. Thank you.
If you go to the Human Development Report, Prime Minister, go ahead, please.
No, I just said, Administrator Steiner, I agree. a lot. And as I said in my opening remarks, we do support the multilateral cooperation. It's crucial, not least in these days. So I would like to thank the administrator also for your efforts, and we'll see you in the future cooperation.
Gentlemen, dare I wrap up this segment? Okay, very good. Thank you very much, Administrator. Thank you very much, Prime Minister. If you go onto the Human Development website, you will find the Human Development Index, and Sweden is number 8 on that index. It is a fascinating way to see your region, your part of the world, and how it rates. We move on with some reflections about what we've heard so far on this global virtual launch of the Human Development Report 2020. Our reflections begin with Minister Olsen. Minister Per Olsenfrid is the State Secretary to the Minister for International Development and Cooperation in Sweden. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much. And Excellencies and ladies and gentlemen, what a day so far, what a launch so far. And as a long-time advocate for transformative climate action, we welcome that UNDP has adjusted the Human Development Report and Index. For the first time, it takes pressure on the pressure we put on the planet, and it takes that into account in this index. And the planet-adjusted Human Development Index fills an important gap by showcasing new and, in some respect, more honest ways of measuring human development. And the new report gives us food for thought and tools for action and improvement. Our planet is in the state of climate emergency. Our relationship with other species is in crisis, with an alarming acceleration of species extinction because of our activities on land and below water. And right now, the world is challenged by the COVID-19 pandemic. Not only do we need to build back better, but more importantly, build back greener. The recovery must be aligned with the ambitions and goals laid out in the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement. We desperately need a world more sustainable, more equal, more gender equal. It is in our common interest. And allow me to be frank. We, the industrialized countries with the means to transition, we must lead the way. Rich countries that are causing the most damage must shoulder their share of responsibility. Sweden, too, has a long way to go. Our material footprint is too large to be sustainable. The same is true of our carbon emissions. However, we're taking forceful actions towards a more sustainable future. The Swedish government has introduced the highest carbon tax in the world and a robust climate act, and is committed to achieving climate neutrality by 2045. We wholeheartedly welcome all competition to beat us to that post. As for Sweden's international development cooperation, we will work continuously to build partnerships with developing countries to support their endeavors to choose a path that is friendly to planet and to people. By increasing our financial for international climate action and biodiversity, we will not only contribute to building resilience for the people most exposed and most vulnerable to climate change and environmental degradation, we will also strive to ensure that tangible results reach those furthest left behind. Now is the time to take more concrete action, to robust invest in green technology, to put an end to fossil fuel subsidies, phase out oil production, stop the construction of new coal power plants, and instead integrate the goal of carbon neutrality into all economic and fiscal policies and decisions. Change is made possible when introducing a do no harm measures and incentives for doing long-term good into our economies. By using nature-based solutions and respecting human rights, gender equality and democratic values, and by using indigenous people's knowledge, things can change. Things will change. And the Human Development Report enhances this momentum. We have no time to lose. We need to fundamentally change our relationship with nature. And this is also the aim of the high-level UN meeting that Sweden has offered to host in Stockholm in June 2022. 50 years since the world gathered in Stockholm in 1972 for the first UN conference on the human environment. This conference can play an important role in promoting a more systematic approach to many of the environmental and climate-related challenges the world is facing today. Change for the better through cooperation is possible, with people and planet at the center, a future to long for, a future to fight for. Thank you.
Many thanks. The Executive Director of United Nations Environment Programme is Inga Anderson. She has been following the global launch of the Human Development Report 2020. I know she's already seen the Human Development Report as well. Executive Director, your reflections, your thoughts?
Well, this has been an extraordinarily interesting evening for me, since I'm not in the US. A very, very interesting discussion. And I think that this new angle of the Human Development Report is more timely than ever. We need that planet-adjusted Human Development Index to fully begin to understand our relationship with nature, as we've also heard from the previous speakers. And if we just look around, the hurricanes in the Atlantic, we've had to even use a Greek alphabet to count them. That's how many we have. Fires, inundations, heat waves, etc. Trillions spent on this recovery to reboot an antiquated and out of the future, not ready for the future economic system. So the Secretary General of the United Nations said it very well, just in his State of the Planet speech. Making peace with nature, he said, is a defining task of the 21st century. It must be, he said, the top priority for everyone, everywhere. And so this new way of looking at human development, adjusting for that making peace with nature, becomes critical. We at UNEP, United Nations Environment Programme, which I have the privilege to head, and which of course was a result of the Stockholm Conference in 1972, to which State Secretary Fred referred. We see three planetary crises that we need to tackle: the climate crisis, the nature crisis, and the pollution and waste crisis. And just last week, we launched the emissions gap report, where we're showing that we're heading towards a 3-degree world at the end of 2100 if we don't take action. So understanding new measurements and integrating this, such as this new Human Development Index, becomes critical. Same for pollution. We are emitting about 400 million tons of heavy metals, sludge, solvents, other wastes into the environment. Surely that has a value detracting from the future equity and sustainability. And surely that's a thing we need to take account of. And as we just heard from the speakers before me, biodiversity, nature, as we heard from Akim, is what feeds us and clothes us and gives us the air we breathe and the water we drink. And yet we are on track to lose and cause extinction to 1 million out of the 7.8 million species that exist. So really and truly, these three planetary crises, we need to understand that not only are they very real, and therefore we need to change the way in which we measure how we deal with development, but they are also profoundly unfair. The world's wealthiest 1%, showed our emissions gap report, account for more than twice of the combined carbon emissions of the poorest 50%. That's something to reflect on. And so at the root of all of this, we have the unsustainable consumption and production. And we heard Prime Minister Löfven speak to this issue. We need to change. We can't continue with the footprint that the wealthy countries have. We need to ensure that we live within sustainable range. And this new Human Development Index that accounts for the planet will help get us there. So we at UNEP, we're very, very proud to have partnered with UNDP in developing this. And we very much salute our friends and Akim's leadership and all the friends at the Human Development Office for this work. Because bringing to the Human Development Index these new metrics matters. We have contributed on the natural capital side, on the inclusive wealth side, and we can see that only by looking at it in this way can we begin to address these three planetary crises that I spoke of: climate crisis, nature crisis, and the pollution crisis. Our planet needs a whole of society approach. We need to think about entire landscapes, entire seascapes, and that support livelihoods, businesses, supply chain, economies, and the next generation. And it is, as we just heard from State Secretary Fred, in everyone's interest, but it is also everyone's responsibility. So with the Human Development Report, we salute it. We're very pleased with this new way of thinking about it. I was in UNDP back 30 years ago when Mahboul introduced, together with Amartya Sen, the new Human Development Index. It was revolutionary at the time. What we're seeing today is a second wave in that journey of thinking differently about development, and it is the right way to go. Thank you, Femi.
Executive Director of UNEP, Inga Anderson, thank you so much. Appreciate you. So that is the first part of our virtual global launch of the Human Development Report. We wrap up the first part with UNDP, Goodwill Ambassadors, and a never-before-seen video. This is the premiere. Take a look.
Throughout time, the planet has shaped all life.
The planet has shaped all life.
The planet has shaped all life.
But now, in the era of the human, we are shaping the planet.
And truthfully, we are not doing a good job at it yet. Our actions are putting a lot of pressure on the world. Just look at 2020 with COVID-19, extreme weather, and rampant wildfires. People have created this mess, but we can fix it.
Empowered people can become agents of their own destiny. The world may seem stuck in its own ways, but we can take actions to create a new normal, whether that's expanding the role of women in society or using cleaner energy.
In too many countries, fossil fuels remain the primary source of energy, but clean alternatives like solar power will help reduce our carbon emissions. These alternatives need to be made accessible and affordable without using too much of other finite resources.
And we must learn to harness the power of nature at the same time as we protect its beauty and wonder. Moving to protect, sustainably manage, and restore ecosystems in a way that promotes well-being.
Too often, the decisions of a few people or countries hurt the most vulnerable people across the world. For all of us to flourish now and into the future, we must understand that we are all connected. The choices you make impact the whole world around you.
Shaping the planet means
taking bold steps.
Bold steps for humans to survive and thrive in this new era.
If we are going to change the world,
we need you.
We need you.
We need you, our global leaders, to take bold action now.
So you are now part of the Leaders' Dialogue. Welcome to your dialogue. In this conversation, you will meet politicians, policymakers, academics, and also the private sector, plus you, of course. So this is the time to use your Q&A box and share your questions, your thoughts about the Human Development Report. We're going a little bit deeper, in fact, a lot deeper, and looking at mechanisms for change. And being very specific here, we're looking at incentives, how regulations may well impact change, the different kind of change that we're looking for, that you've heard our first group of speakers all talking about and advocating for. I want you to meet your panel, meet the people in the dialogue, and then we'll have a deeper conversation with them. So, Senior Minister Tharman from Singapore, I would like you to introduce yourself to our global audience and tell them very briefly your connection with the Human Development Report. It's a good one.
Well, thanks for me. My name is Tharman Shanmugaratnam. I'm a Senior Minister in Singapore. I had the privilege of co-chairing the Advisory Council for the Human Development Report this year with Professor Michael Spence. And it's been a real privilege and a real learning journey for all of us.
Great to have you. More from you in just a moment. Minister Andrea Meza Morillo, nice to see you. Please introduce yourself and the connection with the Human Development Report for this year that you have. Go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning. Good night. I'm Andrea Meza. I'm the Minister of Energy and Environment from Costa Rica, and we are delighted of being here and learning from these new approaches on how to measure development and what development means. So we are very excited to share a little bit about the experience of Costa Rica in nature-based elements.
Mm-hmm. I'm looking forward to that. Roberto Marquez is also joining us, really representing the private sector. Not all of it, but for his specific point of view. Would you introduce yourself, tell our global audience what is important about what you represent and the connection with the Human Development Report for this year?
Of course, Femi, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. It's great to be here on this very important day. Very inspiring so far, the sessions. And for us, Natura & Co., which is a company that is present over 100 countries, touching, over 200 million customers, the idea of a human development, the idea of how we can really balance and drive business growth in a more sustainable, equitable, and just way, it is just something that is really core to everything we do, and we continue to learn and be inspired by what we heard so far today. So very excited to be here.
Yeah, the previous speakers have set the bar high, but I believe in you. I know you're going to be able to do this beautifully. Professor Reyes, so good to see you. Will you introduce yourself to our audience? Everybody has so many amazing titles. I wanted them to introduce themselves to you in a way that framed why they were in this particular launch. And also, of course, your connection to the Human Development Report 2020. Hello, Professor Reyes.
Thanks so much, Femi, and it's a real honor to be here. So my name is Belinda Reyes, and I hold the research chair in sustainability science at the newly established Future Africa Institute at the University of Pretoria here in South Africa. But I also am a senior advisor at the Stockholm Resilience Center at Stockholm University in Sweden, which is actually how I became connected to this Human Development Report, as both a contributor to much of the background information on the science of the Anthropocene, and especially the science around people-planet relationships in the Anthropocene. And then I was also very privileged to be one of the reviewers of the final report, which was a great task and a really pleasant undertaking. Thank you.
Oh, you're so welcome, everybody. All right, this is your dialogue, so whenever you need to speak, you just go ahead. I am your mere facilitator. Thalman, let's start with you. Takeaway. This is hardcore. Takeaway for policymakers out of this Human Development Report. The takeaway regarding the incentives. What do you think will make change happen?
So, first of all, I think we have to dispel the idea that we have to choose between growth and non-growth, or even degrowth. And I say this because there is still debate on this. There's still a significant body of opinion that says we should stop growing, or at the very least, upper middle income countries and rich countries should stop growing. What the report shows is that we don't have to choose between growth and non-growth, between development and non-development, between human development and planetary sustainability. There is a large arena of viable choices that allow us to pursue growth and development and ensure a sustainable planet and ensure that we preserve the biodiversity that is in fact the life support system for human development. And the report does it not just by incantation or by nice-sounding political statements, but by showing that there are those viable choices. And it requires incentives, it requires regulation, it requires investment, including a role for public investment and public-private partnerships. It requires changes in social norms that are ultimately underpinned by a new set of values. One thing that we have to recognize is that we're not going to get onto this path of sustainable growth, inclusive and sustainable growth, if we simply rely on the markets, because it's the markets that have brought us here to begin with. If we leave it to the markets, we'll continue for a while yet on an unsustainable path. And not because markets are motivated by bad people, it's just in the nature of competitive markets that we'll continue along an unsustainable path until we have our backs against the wall. And it'll then be too late. It'll be too late to reverse unsustainability and the loss and the tilt in the world's, the globe, the planet's biological balance. It'll be too late. So we have to act now, and we have to act using public policy, using new public-private partnerships, and using collective action, the agency of people to shape new norms. And it can be done, and that's, in my view, the richest part of this report is about how it's actually being done around the world in both advanced countries and developing countries. Specific examples, not necessarily nationwide projects, but community action or private corporations who are now in fact embarking on whole new growth strategies. It can be done, and we have to scale up those examples. Incentives matter. You have to put a price on carbon. We have to move away from fossil fuel subsidies, which, by the way, are big. They are big around the world. There's a whole range of countries where fossil fuel subsidies amount to something like 2 to 3% of GDP, or half the education budgets of many countries. It'll need not just pricing, it'll need regulation, because pricing alone is going to take a while before it changes economic choices and consumption choices. It's going to need investment. And remember this, the better we invest in new technologies that can reduce the costs of clean and green energies and make zero carbon energy a possibility at some point in the future at acceptable costs. The better we do that, the less we'll have to raise carbon taxes in the future. Carbon taxes will have to go up, but they'll go up by much less if we succeed in investing in new technologies that drive down the costs of the alternatives to fossil fuels. And finally, agency is important. Social norms are important, coming out of not just bold political choices, but coming out of the small d in democracies, not just the big D, but the small d. Groups, individuals, NGOs, civil society, communities, having the agency to start their own initiatives, understand spread awareness about the issues, and to start shaping new social norms. And of course, finally, multilateral action. This is about a global externality, as the economists would put it, and you need global public goods, but you also need every nation to play its part. And we need to exercise peer pressure on each other, hold ourselves up to our own commitments, and nudge those commitments forward over time. We should take advantage of COVID in one respect. COVID's been a tragedy around the world, but the silver lining is that it's led to a new zeitgeist. People recognize there's such a thing as the public good. People recognize that everyone has to play their part. People recognize there's a role for governments, for public action, and new public-private partnerships. And we've got to take advantage of the zeitgeist to invest big in sustainability, to have a bold role for public policy in incentives and regulation, and to shape new norms. I'll stop there.
As you were speaking, Andrea was nodding, and if I remember correctly, it was the point where Thalman was saying you don't have to sacrifice growth. That seemed to resonate with you. Can you pick up from that point? What was the point of agreement? And then take us on and give us those real down on the ground examples that you said you wanted to share with us from Costa Rica.
Thank you. And absolutely, this really resounds on the elements that I would like to share. One is that the country has progressed 37 position in the Human Development Index. And I will say that this is a demonstration that nature-based human development is possible. And I absolutely see that this shows that policy matters. It was 20 years ago that we decided to prohibit land use change, but at the same time, we generated an incentive, a new mechanism, and it was the payment for environmental services scheme. So it was regulation and an incentive. And these two elements need to be there, and clear policies. Absolutely. These elements are central. And if we decided then to create a tax on fossil fuels 20 years ago to generate this fund, and at the same time to mobilize resources to the owners of the forest. And again, we need to also give some value to nature, and at the same time, people there in the rural territories are recognizing that this generates a benefit for them. Most of the funds that we have been collecting from this tax on fossil fuels, we are directing these funds to rural communities. More than $500 million for a middle-income country. I know that sometimes it doesn't sound too much, but it is money. It is our own resources, a policy decision that we are mobilizing to improve and to help more than 15,000 families in the rural territories, and a lot of them indigenous communities. And again, what we are seeing is that we need to make and have a clear analysis of where we want to go. And right now we launch our long-term strategy, which is our decarbonization plan. And we are also committed to be carbon neutral in 2050. And again, this is not an environmental issue. This is a development model. Again, we are making choices on what is the kind of development that we want to bring. And we are defining pathways for the new urban areas, for the rural territories, for the kind of innovation that we want. We need to have policy coherence. And of course, this will demand, again, some transformational elements also in green fiscal reforms. And it's the kind of analysis that we are doing, is the kind of arguments. If we want to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, and I totally agree, and we still have some elements that we need to improve in that area, we also need to see the distributional impacts of those kind of measures. And again, do the balance to implement some coherence in this kind of policies. So we really want to welcome the report. We think it's a very good contribution when we have new measures on what development means. And it's the kind of arguments that when we need also at the local level, because we are facing some difficult times, as all the countries with the COVID crisis, a small fiscal space. And we are also hearing some voices that would like to take another pathway. So when we are hearing that we want to have well-being, and that it is possible also with nature-based solutions, is the kind of elements that we need to continue to implement and to improve. I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Roberto, the phrase that I'm hearing a lot this year, because COVID-19 has given us all this reset, everything's shut down before it springs back up again, and the idea of let's get back to normal, and then there's this push about let's not get back to normal, let's do things differently. So if you're looking at potentially incentives or maybe regulations that will work from the private sector's point of view, what would you tell us? What would you advise us? What works for you and your organization, your company, your business?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So listen, I think as we are hearing, and I completely agree, I think the private sector has a very important role. The first one is to understand and embrace that it's not growth at any cost, right? We need to think about sustainable growth. And it is possible, it's absolutely possible to combine economic development in a sustainable way, right? And I think we also need to be clear about the choices that we make and how we hold ourselves accountable, which goes back to your point of incentives and how we really raise the bar. So I'll give you the example of Natura & Co. Earlier this year, in the middle of this pandemic, we actually issued our 2030 commitment to life, or sustainability plans. We set very ambitious target. We want to become net zero emission by 2030, 20 years ahead of the commitment with the United Nations. We want to make sure that we pay living wage or above to all of our associates, 40,000 of them. In Brazil, we've already been inspired by the human development and tracking the human development progress with our consultants. Globally now we have over 6 million of them. Just in the last 2 years, by really tracking and focusing on that, we've seen double-digit improvement in health and financial knowledge within the network of our consultants and representatives. We are very committed also to drive circularity of our packaging, biodegradable, renewable ingredients in our formulation. By setting those targets high, I also think that you end up driving innovation. And again, it's not either or. By really embracing those things, you really drive a very innovative mindset in the organization. People want to do this. And if you, again, set the right direction, you make the right choices, and you hold yourselves accountable. So part of the incentives, that's very important, part of the incentives of our executives is linked to delivering against sustainability goals. It's not just delivering the profit, or it's not just delivering, the financial results, but it's about the planet, it's about people, right? So if you combine those things, it's absolutely doable. Natura has been working in the Amazon for 20 years and has demonstrated that it is possible to actually drive economic progress for those communities and keeping the forest standing, right? It does require effort. It does require leadership. It does require choices, and also this notion that it's not growth at any cost. The good news, Penny, is that I see more and more the investor community, the market, paying more attention to ESGs, paying more attention to companies and making those choices, the incentives that we're referring to companies that actually are embracing that. But we need more. We need many more companies, private sector, multilateral approach to make sure that this becomes a reality. So the private sector needs to play its role, and its role of really embracing sustainable growth and embracing that it's more than just the bottom line, but it's really combining planet, people, and profit.
What I'm hearing so far from our leaders' dialogue is hope and change. That is possible, to borrow a phrase from somewhere else and someplace else. Belinda, jump in here. Although I feel that people have stolen your thunder, because there is total agreement here with the idea that people do not have to be versing the planet. It doesn't have to be either or. Expand on that more, please.
Yeah, exactly, Femi. I think as many of the previous speakers and now as the ministers have just highlighted, these things like climate change and species extinctions and deforestation and pollution that we used to label environmental impacts or environmental risks, they're now actually development risks. And especially in the context of the Anthropocene, this hyper-connected and rapidly changing world that we now live in, an environmental impact in one part of the world can ripple and connect across scales and land with social and economic consequences in a far distant place, like a drought in Central Asia causing a food price spike in South Africa. And I think this really brings to the fore the point that many speakers are making, that we can't choose a policy or an action that's good for development and bad for environment. If it's bad for environment, it will be bad for development at some other time, in some other place, or for some other group. And what this report really helps to make clear is that it's not really about choosing between environment and development. At this moment, we're making choices that are bad for both. And we now really need to move ahead with a very clear-headed approach to policies and actions and practices that are good for people and the planet. And I think that, as both of the ministers had made clear, what this approach really helps us to do, this approach of people and planet, is to move behind this very blinkered or binary view we have of environment as protected areas which keep people out, and development as industrial economic growth and job creations of mines and factories, to actually find this very fertile middle ground of actions and projects and policies that build justice and peace and sustainability and regenerative practices and the necessary resilience capacities we're all going to need to navigate this turbulence that lies ahead.
Leaders,
I'll leave it there for now and be happy to come back with some more details.
Thank you so much. Leaders, I'm opening up this conversation because our global virtual human development report audience would like to speak to you directly. So this is Christopher Howes. What are the innovative approaches proposed that aim to tackle the impact of humans on the planet? Don't have to name all of them. Christopher, we don't want to do a spoiler for you. I do want you to read the Human Development Report. But some of the innovative approaches, what stood out for you? Tharman, go ahead.
Well, in fact, the impressive thing is in just the last 5 years, you've seen a whole set of new initiatives. We're listening to what Natura was doing. We're listening to examples across the world, including in relatively poor countries, by the way. You can take examples of countries which are disadvantaged in terms of size and natural resources. I mean, Singapore is an extreme example. Very small, virtually zero natural resources, no renewable energy potential within the country. But what we're doing, as an example, is to invest in floating solar photovoltaic systems, floating on the few reservoirs we have within the island and floating offshore. And in fact, we're now investing in what will be one of the world's largest such floating solar farms. It's an example of how necessity forces innovation. And there are lots of other choices. Some are very practical devices. In India, for instance, they're building large solar parks, so to speak, so that companies can come in and plug and play with less upfront construction costs, a lot of the logistics catered for. But when you plan industrial parks such that each player who comes in finds it much easier to be able to move to gear up on a renewable basis. I gave the example of solar parks, but there are many other examples. By taking care of the public goods dimension of an industrial park, you also make it easier for market players. So lots of innovations. And my sense is that this combination of incentives and disincentives, which come from pricing carbon and withdrawing fossil fuel subsidies, and as was pointed out, you've got to make sure as you withdraw subsidies that it's not unfair to the poor. You'll have to find some other ways of compensating, right? But it's not just about pricing and subsidies. It's about investment. It's about investment because the market on its own will find very often that the upfront costs of investment in these new technologies is too high, and you don't yet have scale of market demand. So the public sector is important. And public-private collaboration has turned out to be the basis on which solar energy has become so cheap, much cheaper than coal. Is the basis on which even wind and other renewable energies are becoming much cheaper. It is public-private collaboration. And likewise, when you look at CCUS, carbon capture, use and storage, what Norway has done, what some other countries have done, it's about public-private collaboration to be able to deal with the upfront costs and get scale into the business before it's
Let me
eventually
just get some more innovation as we push on with some more questions. We have 1,700 people on the platform, and I want to get to a few more of their questions, if that's possible. Roberto, innovation for you. What have you seen? What would you share with Chris to say, it is possible for us to actually live with the planet, and this is one idea. What would you like to share?
Well, I would probably, and I mentioned, share, the work that Natura has been doing for 20 years in the Amazon, really working with the local communities on biodiversity and really seeing what's possible to really, get the science, get the technology, get solutions that potentially will create better products for the consumers, while at the same time keeping the forest standing and helping the communities to actually develop themselves. And we do that respecting the Nagoya Protocol, with not just pay for the communities on the ingredients that we are sourcing from them, but paying for their knowledge. which is almost like intellectual property, because those communities really detain those kind of information and intelligence. So very important to have those partnerships. And we heard also from the minister that, on the report, and we were very clear that just GDP growth is not going to reduce inequality. So, all of us needs to work together in how to better distribute income, how to work with local communities. And the example of the Amazon, it's a win-win. You're helping the communities, you're helping preserving the forest, and you're making the companies more successful. So it's not a trade-off. And I think there are plenty of other examples that we get inspired by. And I think hopefully this will become, to your point, the new norm, moving forward.
Belinda, let me put this one to you. This question comes from Anne Ackerlund from SIDA. And Anne says, as we move forward to implement needed changes for sustainable human progress within planetary boundaries, how can we make sure that we do not exacerbate existing grievances and inequalities, but rather seize on opportunities to enhance cooperation and social cohesion? How do we make sure to integrate conflict sensitivity in our efforts and the work that we do? The reason I want to throw that one to you is because I know that you're in the Global South, you think about the Global South, and you think about these issues from that perspective as well. Go ahead.
Well, that is an enormous question, a very important question, and one that could probably take me all day to answer. But I think perhaps two things spring to mind with that. The first is the Human Development Report actually talks about this three-pronged approach: innovation, equity, and stewardship of the planet. And what this suggests to me is we don't get too focused on just innovation, but we keep balancing it with thinking about, is it good for equality and is it good for the planet? Because innovation is no stranger to development. We've relied on lots of technology and lots of innovation and incentives in the past. So I feel like this more multidimensional approach to innovation is perhaps one that is important, because I think we have to acknowledge that we're not playing on a level playing field. And any innovation or any intervention has the potential to make that more level or less level. And I think that that's really key. If I look at the renewable energies example here in South Africa, that has enormous potential to enhance energy democracy and energy equality, as well as reduce carbon emissions. But unless we're very careful about how that is implemented, there are real consequences for job losses in the mining sector, for massive changes in the decentralization of electricity as well, that could actually have many unintended consequences. So I think that perhaps this is one thing that the report makes clear to me. And perhaps just a second point, that a lot of the time when we focus on the role of environment in development, we tend to often think about it as a material resource. And I think that there's a stronger voice coming now from the Global South, really highlighting that the environment isn't just a set of materials like water and food, but actually shapes identities and cultures and our relationships and our well-being in deep and important ways. And so I think it's also important that we think about innovation and social ecological innovation that's sensitive to these non-material links that communities have with their environment as well.
Andrea, you are making notes on your notepad. Share your notepad with us.
Yes, it's so inspiring listening to all these elements. It is critical whole of a government and whole of society approach. I will say that this is one of the key elements that we're hearing, and that this interaction with the private sector is central. We in the policy making area, we need to define clear policies, long-term policies, because this is a transformational element that will take time, and it is critical to have long-term plans. And at the same time, all these elements of innovation, how can we bring more the private sector? What are the kind of signals that we are giving? It's a central element. And of course, carbon pricing is critical. Carbon pricing must be there. The fossil fuel subsidies, we need to eliminate them. but it's also about investments. And I will say that we have been working in the enhancement of our NDC with the support of UNDP, by the way. And what we also are doing right now is generating our green recovery plan. And it is identifying the kind of investments that at the same time will allow us to generate green and blue jobs, and that it is possible, again, that we can identify good investments that will generate green and blue jobs. And also, we are having some analysis on how to green the financial system. And I would say that this is also another innovation out there. And we need to continue with that kind of work. We established some dialogues here with our bank system, with the regulators, but there are international aspects like the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosures. And I think that these aspects are also contributing to this transformational change. Our central bank, for example, has just become member of the network of greening the financial sector. And I would say that if we manage to put all these building blocks, good policies, incentives, regulations, and bring in the financial sector, then we will be able to do this transformation. And I think we are there. We are hearing here good examples. I totally agree that the private sector is there. It's looking for good opportunities for doing these investments, and we need to mobilize public and private resources aligned with this vision.
Roberta, I want to give this question to you. This one comes from Andy Davis. Do we need to redefine our ideas of growth to move away from market-driven concept of growth for its own sake? I am wondering how the private sector would even think about that. What is the point if you don't grow?
Well, and I agree. I mean, as I said earlier, I think the era of growth at any cost is gone. I think, consumers, customers, people in general are demanding companies to be more responsible, and the market should follow that, right? And that's why I am optimistic, because I see more and more investors paying more attention to companies that are really follow ESG principles with balance, again, planet, profit, and people, right? At the end of the day, companies are not going to run a business in a dead planet, period, right? And we're not going to run a business if we continue to drive huge inequality, because there are going to be fewer and fewer households to consume our products. So you needed to address the climate crisis, we need to address inequality, and that needs to be front and center as part of the strategy for any organization moving forward. The good news is, I think, it's coming because there is pressure from society, pressure from the customers themselves in terms of how they're choosing companies to buy from, how they're choosing products to consume from it. So it's becoming like a consequence of that. So I'm absolutely against, to be clear, growth at any cost. It has to be sustainable growth, and it has to be balanced with the notion of planet, people, and profit. And again, it is not either or. It is possible to combine both. It is possible to create positive impact. It drives innovation, it drives the right behavior, and companies will succeed even more by embracing that. So it's not about abandoning success of the private companies or enterprise, but it is doing in a different way, in a more inclusive way, in a more sustainable way.
Okay, leaders, I am going to give you one more question, and you have just under a minute to answer each. We're going to tag team this answer to leave our audience with something to go away with that is going to be very tangible. So thank you. Dag Johnson and Asa Nielsen. This is a great double-barrel question. How can citizens best support our leaders or governments to achieve real transition to sustainable development? How can we as citizens support a courageous political leadership required for the necessary transformation to tackle the changing climate? What can we do, but a very sophisticated version of what can we do? You have 1 minute each to do this in. You are leaders. I know you can handle this. Andrea, go ahead.
There's a strong impact of what citizens can do. You are consumers, so you make choices on what you define you will choose as consumers, and you also are there to vote, and you will also elect who will be leading your country. So I think that these are powerful elements that we need to consider when we are talking about the power of citizens, which is huge.
Roberto.
I could not agree more. Hold ourselves accountable. Hold ourselves accountable in the private sector by making the choice. Hold the politicians accountable by your vote, right? Hold ourselves accountable. I mean, the power of the citizens, the power of society is enormous. And if they put that at test, they will make, the outcome better.
And Tharman, finally, bring us home.
So, so that I don't repeat the very useful points that have just been made, let me make a different point that complements what's being said. Let's not lose sight of the fact that the basics of development are still critical. If we don't invest in better education, better healthcare, better opportunities for people, and give people a chance for optimism in their lives, which is the traditional set of human development objectives. If we don't do that well, we're not going to achieve sustainability either. Because apart from communities which are already directly affected by global warming, the warming of the oceans and fishing communities being affected, for instance, most people, the bulk of humanity, if they don't see an optimistic future for themselves, if they haven't been invested in themselves, they're not going to evolve new social norms. They're not going to provide the political space for policy actions and new collaboration to tackle sustainability. So I'm making that converse point. This discussion is not just about the urgency of taking action on sustainability, which is obvious. It's also about the urgency of taking action to invest in people, which is still a huge international challenge. Education, healthcare, opportunities for jobs. If we don't do that, we're not going to be able to tackle the sustainability challenge.
Okay. And Belinda, go ahead.
Great. Thanks, Remy. I think what often confronts people is the sense of the challenges are so enormous and so urgent, there's almost a collective paralysis. But in fact, science, which has been under attack in 2020, has actually managed to distill out from this complexity just a few sets of drivers and structures that really are the causal factors behind a number of the crises we see unfolding in front of us. And so my advice would be to use the science and focus on those small leverage points that have the potential for such enormous change, and these sort of cascading very positive effects from that change.
Leaders, thank you very much for wrapping up our conversation today. Really appreciate you. You were excellent. Thank you for the brilliant questions as well from all of the different platforms. Really appreciate you. So now I'm able to say that the Human Development Report 2020, The New Frontier, Human Development and the Anthropocene, the Age of Man, is now officially launched. This has been a UNDP Sweden co-production. Thanks for watching. Take care, everybody.